Hello, welcome. I'm Faye from SF Urban Film Fest. I see a few folks just joining. Hello. Tonight's program is Tell It Like It Is, Conversations Between the Global North and South on Design and Community Life in Human Settlements. It's co-presented by the University of San Francisco. This program is really personal for me because I'm an immigrant from Jakarta, Indonesia, and I'm now based in San Francisco. And our panel also straddle the worlds of the global North and the global South. And I will bring them on one by one right now. So first up is our moderator, Tanu Sankalia. Hi, Tanu.
Hi there. How are you?
Thanks for joining us from all the way across town
Yeah.
in San Francisco. Tanu
Happy to be here.
Sankalia is professor of architecture and urban studies at USF. His work focuses on urbanism in India, Latin America, and the Bay Area. Next up is Susanna Solomon.
Hi.
Hi, Susanna. Susanna, we just saw your amazing film, Mercato. Welcome, welcome. Susanna is a social documentary filmmaker, multimedia visual artist, educator. She was born in Kenya, grew up in Ethiopia, and now lives in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where she lectures at the University of Pennsylvania. Hi. Okay, so, and then next up is Beatrice Hati Gitundu. Hi, Beatrice.
Hi. Hi, Faye. Hi, everyone.
Hi, welcome, welcome. Welcome
Thank you
to
so much.
the SF Urban Film Fest here in San Francisco. Beatrice hails from Nairobi. She is an urban planner there, and she's a Kenyan national and is currently a PhD student at Erasmus University in the Netherlands. Welcome, Beatrice.
Thank you so much, Faye.
Yes, and then I want to call into the room Jessica Prado. Jessica, hi.
Hi, how's it going? Good to see you guys tonight. Thank you for having me.
Jessica, welcome back to Fest 2022. Jessica was here last year at our 2021 festival, when she interviewed SF District Attorney Chesa Boudin on 36 questions for civic love. Jessica also curated a program for the festival called People-Led Solutions for Housing. Jessica is a multimedia journalist and activist. She was born in Mexico, grew up in Chicago, and now makes Berkeley, California her home base. So,
yeah, thank you guys.
Yes, welcome back, Jessica. And now I'm going to hand it over to the panel and sign off and have a great discussion.
Thank you, Faye. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. So I just want to get us going with maybe thinking about informal settlements, how we define them, how we think about them, how we think about community and informal settlements, and maybe we can start Susanna, then Beatrice and Jessica. If you could all perhaps reflect on this question, and then also maybe tie it up with your own work and what you've done, and maybe that way the audience will get to know you and your work as well. That'd be great. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, that's an interesting notion. So this project Mercado, just documenting a very old 75-year-old open air market in Ethiopia. This idea that anybody can set up a shop and create an entrepreneurship out of anything, just this idea of selling and buying and this exchange, and how that can create stability and develop a community. So so this idea was really fascinating to me, that you can buy and sell anything in this space without formal regulation or anything, and that it's in this precipice of transition and formality. So Mercado is just a fascinating ecosystem of power and cultural exchange. And so this project is really a precipice for documenting the lives of workers and merchants that kind of built their own created their own community and power from selling and having their own environment to buy and exchange. So just loving this idea of documenting merchants over a period of time, as it transitions into more structural formality. So that's Mercado, the project. I did this in 2013. And since then, it's been, developed. Thank you. It's been developed in so many ways. And so, just really capturing what the power of open air market structures can be to, especially third world countries in the precipice of development. So that is, my work goes into social documentary and just capturing human narrative, very personal narratives within social, political, preservations of culture, etc. So, so that is Mercado, and I'm glad you guys.
Thank you, and maybe Beatrice, maybe I'll give you a little prompt just in terms of since we're talking about informal settlements, but when we look at the global South, we're looking at in many cities. In Mumbai, where I grew up, 60% of the population of Mumbai is in informal settlements. So, not in proper apartment buildings. But there's, of course, a gradation to that. In the global North, we think there are about 10% of people, a little less, that are largely unhoused. So how do you think of informal settlements? How do you define them? And how do they intersect with your work?
Right. Thank you, Tanu. And thank you, Susanna, also for the amazing film and also for the other films that we have watched. Tricky question there, Tanu, when you asked the definition of informal settlements. As my introduction was put forward by Faye, she mentioned that I'm also a scholar. So as scholars, we get to be very sensitive in defining terms. So I will give a disclaimer that eventually I'll not give a definition, but possibly I'll give pointers which really help us understand what informal settlements are. And basically, I've engaged with informal settlements for over 5 years now, both as a researcher, as an observer, because of course I come from Nairobi, and here the status of informality is really high because we have over 60% of the population living in informal settlements. So I've interacted with this concept and this notion for a really long time. And what I find is that despite the ubiquity or maybe the popular use of the term, both in literature and also in practice, we find there is no universally acceptable definition of informal settlements. And basically because the concept really varies according to socio-political contexts. So for example, in Nairobi, the mere fact that a settlement would lack infrastructure, let's talk of water, transportation, drainage, sanitation, that would be considered an informal settlement. In another part of the world, possibly the lack of tenure security, the fact that you don't own the land that you're settling in, would be considered already an informal settlement. So I think based on the socio-political context, then informality definition may differ. And of course, we find there is a lot of emerging terminologies. Like for example, in Nairobi, we popularly call informal settlements ghetto. I don't know if it's also common in other areas. I also hear other settlements, like for example, in Venezuela, calling informal settlements barrio. There's also favela, also common maybe in the areas of Brazil and others. And possibly the list is endless. There are different names used to refer to informal settlements. But basically what these are is neighborhoods or housing establishments that basically emerge outside state control. And these settlements most of the time will not have formal infrastructure of water, sanitation, and other elements that I mentioned earlier. And you find that the transactions that happen within these settlements basically operate outside state control. So sometimes they may be controlled by residents, sometimes the private sector, and it's just a whole informal sector working around the informal settlements. So I think Tanu will not give a definite definition, but possibly these pointers can already direct you to what an informal settlement is. And of course, maybe also how a capitalist market economy emerges around the informal sector. Because like, for example, in the informal settlements of Nairobi, because they basically do not have formal access to services, basic services, and sometimes social protection. Then the private sector emerges to fill this gap, and sometimes in exploitative ways. For example, we find that people in formal settlements will pay 4 times water costs, 2 times electricity cost as compared to formal areas. So you find exploitation emerging around this delivery of services. So yeah, this is basically my interaction with informal settlements. I've worked with different informal settlements in Nairobi, planning for different settlements. I started engaging in a very informal way because you realize there was no regulatory framework to guide the planning of informal settlements. So I would engage with residents in advocacy endeavors to try and push the government to provide services. And later, this has morphed to more formal engagement, where, of course, we are engaging in planning activities that are guided by the government or that are superintended by the government. And yeah, that's basically my engagement. And so I also relate with all the aspects that I see on the videos, although the context may differ a little bit. Yeah, thank you, Tanu.
That's a wonderful answer and description, especially considering socioeconomic context. I think that was spot on there. Jessica, would you like to talk about your experience with informal settlements and communities and maybe tie it up with your own work?
Yeah, no, thank you, Tanu. Yeah, so basically I grew up in an informal settlement in Mexico. It was actually one of the largest slums in Mexico. It was right next to Mexico City. So what happened, it was like vacant land and everybody started settling there in the 80s. And then the Mexican government started selling those little patches of land, sometimes even more than once to different people. So then people eventually gained land and then they were able to build, right? I mean, of course they started with really humble homes. Like my grandparents had like an aluminum, home, with cardboard and like aluminum sheets. So like it was humble. But then because they were able to acquire land, they were able to like eventually be able to build up. And that's what everybody in that city did. I mean, eventually became a city now. Yeah, and I think that was wonderful because, it is the people that can make it work, And I have seen it happen, with my grandparents and my parents, they built, there was no sewage, there was no paved roads, and the people themselves did it all themselves because, the best Mexican government didn't have the resources to actually make it a city. So this was just a way of the people lifting each other. And I think it was because of like community activism that really my hometown became a city. So that was like one of the experiences. And then now I live in Berkeley, California, and I've been living in another informal settlement. So while I was going to school, through graduate school, I lost my housing and then I ended up living in an RV. And then since then, I've been able to meet the community that lives here in the Bay Area on the streets. There's different communities and different people all over. And I would say that unfortunately here, encampments in the Bay Area don't last very long. So all these informal settlements that form throughout, you're very lucky if they do last long. And that really takes a lot of political activism in order for these encampments to remain, And that's hard because, you're in survival mode. The most important thing in your everyday life is just being able to have, the resources to like, bathe, to like eat, to sleep, find a place of rest. So it's really hard for like people to stand up and really claim land. So that's what's happening here in the Bay Area. It's just like there's a lot of people, but like it's really hard to go against all the sweeps, the constant movement and displacement of people. And then there is offers of housing, but of course there's not enough housing for everyone. And then people are finding shelter themselves, right? In vehicles and tents and anything that they can find. But here the government, like city governments here are not very, they're not very, they don't want that, they will want infrastructure to be built. And like, we can have infrastructure and we should definitely build it. But like, I feel like there's not enough political will at the moment to actually get that done. Like there's small little projects here and there, but like not something that actually is infrastructure for all people, But yeah, that's been my experience. And then some of my work that I have done in informal settlements is basically just documenting the lives of people living in their vehicles. I published a project in the summer of 2020, basically where I documented the lives of people throughout a whole year. And then I also did a short film on how I live myself in my vehicle. So yeah, just being able to share that experience, hopefully that helps to shed a different light that the people that are out here are also, your grandparents, your uncles, your cousins, like their family, but we just don't see them as such because we don't communicate. So I just think that, there's some gaps that we have to bridge. And I feel like the biggest one right now is communication. So yeah, thank you.
Great. And I think we're hopefully trying to communicate out here. So I just want to switch the topic a little bit to, I mean, since we've been talking about informality, probably the obverse of it is formality. And so one way to think about formality is really through the role of the state, the government. The government has a huge part to play in both the creation and the destruction of informal settlements. So, and I just want to give you a few examples. Again, in Mumbai, where I grew up, slum eradication plans were always huge. There would be bulldozers that would come and knock slums out. In the United States, the global north, slum eradication, has been a big sort of part of urban renewal, starting in 1949 and going forward. But even in the late 19th century city, in the mid 19th century city in Europe, and so on. In places like Mexico, the tianguis that came up, in cities like Mexico City and other places were informal markets. When in the 19th century, the government could not provide mercados, for actual, marketplaces so that people can go and sell their wares. So because of the lack of government support, informality was created, informality is created, and governments try to sort of knock them out. And then you see the case of Torre David, which is also very interesting because in one way it reads also as a failure of the state. It marks a moment in the sort of petro economy of Venezuela, which achieves this sort of height at a point in the early 2000s. They build this whole downtown, which is largely a sort of result of capitalism and petrodollars, and everything comes to a standstill. And as it comes to a standstill, also with the rise of the government on the left with Chavez, the entire sort of economy collapses, and places like these, where construction is halted, become spaces which are occupied, and the government condones them in a way, also as a sort of a critique, of the capitalist petro order, which they seemingly displaced. So the state has a very complex role to play in what happens with formality and an informal settlement. So maybe all three of you could reflect a little bit on that. I don't know. Maybe we can, anyone can start. Maybe Susanna, you want to reflect on how you see the role of the state, and especially maybe with the example of Mercato itself, because how that came up 75 years ago, and this beautiful footage we saw at the end was also reminiscent of what happened in the early years. So over to you. Yeah. You're muted.
I'm so sorry. Still getting used to this. Yeah, thank you. Part of the inspiration for the project is seeing the transition and how the state, considerably taking ownership in this marketplace and trying to revitalize it through creating malls and structured buildings to revitalize, a better, just like a more glossier aspect of this exchange of selling. And so what happened, or what is happening, is that these sellers are forced to pay higher rent, to be in these very polished stalls and sell butter and sell these very like tangible items, where they're used to be selling on the ground, now in these very polished mall spaces. And so so that transition, or the transitioning that's happening in Mercado, is really kind of the foundation for this project, to see, how does this affect the merchants? How does this affect this aspect of entrepreneurship? So it's interesting, very political, but I chose very specifically to focus on just the merchants and not the government, and not, just to kind of preserve the voice of the market that is slowly being erased. And so, so this project, the perspective only speaks to that. But you do see the fear and the kind of, insecurity in the merchants, knowing that the walls are being built. There's, Hawa, who says, I was here before this wall. And that's kind of a testament to her understanding of this transition that's taking place and this erasure that's being taken place. But I think that omission of, what's happening on the other side just is kind of this ominous for the film. So yeah, so it's a very, complicated narrative, but I do know that, folks are continuing to, doing their best to sustain what they know, how to be, and how to hold on to, what they're being handed, so it's a complicated issue, but I do think that there's something really powerful about the understanding of the transition, and the voice that is buried underneath. So.
And maybe Jessica, you could talk about a little bit, because you sort of ended also with the notion of the government, and how constantly under threat, from the state, from the government, and so on. So can you reflect on this a little bit in your own experience?
Yeah. I mean, when you started, you put this really well. Like, like when the government doesn't support you, informality is going to happen. And that's what has happened, like people taking care of themselves. And then the government just comes in, like, just wants to, like, erase it because it's not something that they thought of, And I feel like it's like, I really feel like we really got to support our communities more, even if their ideas come from the streets, I feel like the people that are experiencing this is actually the people that have the best ideas, the best solutions for themselves. And I think that's what they really are trying to do. Like, for instance, there is no housing right now. So the informality that has become is that people are going to seek alternative shelter, so they're going to seek either vehicles or tents or whatever affordable shelter they can obtain, right? So I just feel like there is a responsibility in the government and in working with them, even after these informalities have, happened, like there is a way to build from there, instead of just erasing it. Like, it takes more work to erase it rather than to build upon it. So I just feel like if we build upon it, then, it'd just be better, we have better solutions for everyone, Yeah.
Beatrice?
Yeah, right. I like the reflection by Jessica and Susanna, and I think also in relation to the practical experiences. And I think what I may say, what I see is that the mere existence of informal settlements screams out so loud that the government is failing or the government has failed. And this is a tendency that is still continuing now, because informal settlements, you may find, were established a couple of years ago, but there are also new emerging informal settlements as well. So as a result of poor governance, then of course you find that people do not have access to housing, adequate housing. And of course we find urbanization is really coming up at a really high rate. So if the government is unable to respond to the need for shelter for people, then of course then informality emerges. I agree completely that the government has a critical role, either in upgrading informal settlements and even avoiding the development of new informal settlements by providing people with shelter. But the big question, or the elephant in the room, is how exactly do government do that with the support of the people? Because for a very long time, and especially in Nairobi, the government and the people have had a very hostile relationship. Yeah, such that even government forces cannot enter an informal settlement, yet, well, we may consider them as the administrative unit. And we have seen very, not really nice relationships over the years. Like, for example, if you look at back at the history of Nairobi and how informal settlements have come up, you realize that after independence, we had these slum clearance policies, rather like to clean the city. And of course, the understanding of a cleaner city was a city without informal settlements. But what actually do you do to the people living in informal settlements? You either provide them adequate housing or incorporate them within the city frameworks, but that was not done. The plan then was to kick people out. But then later, I really want to appreciate the fact that governments, and especially in Nairobi, have been showing support towards informal settlements, because in the new millennium, we have seen new policies being developed to support slum upgrading. So like, for example, we have a national slum upgrading and prevention policy that really looks at how the unsheltered can really be provided shelter and proper infrastructure. And we also have development of new planning strategies, because I think for those who have interacted with the planning kits of formal and informal settlements, you realize that what works in a formal settlement definitely cannot work in an informal settlement. So our need to review these policy frameworks has also emerged in Nairobi. So like, for example, an 18-meter road that would work perfectly in a formal settlement cannot be implemented in an informal settlement, because basically there's no space to provide that infrastructure. And so what Nairobi has done is integrated the planning framework for informal settlements through a special planning area approach. So basically this is an approach that allows special characteristics, special planning approaches for a settlement that also indicates unique characteristics. So we have seen this happening in practice for one of the settlements, but I would say this is an approach that is still under development. But generally, the role of the government is really critical. What we see emerging also from the conversations here is that informal settlers will always try to earn their day. Every day is earned in an informal settlement. And so the solutions that really come up are really survival based. Yeah, so the sustainability of what comes up is really questionable a bit. So like, for example, if there is no water or if there's flooding in a settlement, people will provide quick solutions that really address the situation at the time, but they really do not have the capacity or even the mandate to provide large-scale infrastructure that would help them in the long term. For example, residents cannot install, let's say, a settlement-wide drainage system, or they cannot install a settlement-wide water supply system. So here the government really needs to come in. So what we call for really is for the government to come in and support actions that are already happening, but also they cannot come in assuming that nothing has been happening in the settlement. Yeah, so there is really need for consideration of local action. So really, Tanu, this is what I can say about government action and really the relationship between governments and people. And we see a bit of a change here. So it's no longer very hostile as it used to be a couple of years back.
Yeah, thank you, Beatrice. Yeah, there's also a comment in the chat here about how the difference between urban renewal and slum clearance. And indeed, I mean, there is a difference. There is, of course, a difference. But I think, and this is from Robin Abad here, you see it. And I think what's interesting is, or what's critical, I think, is a view that emanates, in government, among authorities, among planning and design circles, among architects, and among the apparatus of the formal state, that begins to see informality, across the spectrum, as though it is antithetical to the idea of the city. So it's a much more fundamental way of beginning to look at the city itself and removing or taking away any signs of disorder in the city. And the informality is associated with disorder, and it's associated with then all the other sort of associations that come with disorder. So I was looking at more from a general standpoint. Of course, the specifics vary in every context. Also, the other interesting example is actually a place like Dharavi, which is one of the largest slums in the world, actually, which is in Mumbai. And Dharavi is extremely diverse in its makeup. And there's a wonderful book written by Lisa Weinstein, which talks about the notion of the durable slum. So even in the global south, this idea that slums are somehow highly precarious settlements on the edges of cities is not accurate. Actually, slums are highly well-entrenched and solid settlements with infrastructure within cities, but of course they vary to a great extent. I mean, there could be 3 to 4 story buildings and 1-story shacks, 3 to 4 story buildings which either tap into electricity or get electricity, and 1-story shacks that don't. So there is that great difference. So these are highly well entrenched places within cities in the global South. So perhaps with that, maybe we can just switch to another topic, which is the idea of a sense of place. And so we kind of see with Mercato, there is this place that people have carved out for themselves. And Susanna, you do a beautiful job of kind of pursuing it through these individual characters. Also, the last, like the historical footage that you showed, the archival footage, which looked at the slum in the past. I mean, sorry, the Mercato in the past had a more benign almost look to it compared to, say, for example, what you see today. It looks far more edgy and far more sort of hard a place compared to what it may have been 50, 60 years ago. So again, that sense of place. Beatrice, in your own work, you've done, in Nairobi, people transforming areas and trying to create some kind of anchor for the community there. With Torre David, I think it's a very, in my opinion, a very kind of a ephemeral, temporary sense of place that's created. I question its authenticity, but again, that's or it's sort of I don't think that's the right word, but it's durability for sure. In fact, it's pretty much gone now. That's a 2014 film, I think. And Jessica, in your own work, I mean, your own life, your own work you've done, how do we sort of see a sense of place in these communities? There is a tendency to romanticize it. I mean, Torre David can be, an example of that with the concrete and so on. It becomes a sort of aestheticization of the high-rise tower and people living in it and who've sort of occupied it and so on. Of course, the occupation is great as a gesture, but there's a sort of romanticizing of the aesthetic of concrete, and so even the Mercato. But I guess what I'm getting at is informal settlements are critical. They'll always be there. They contain a sense of place. Many of them, like the Tiangis, came out of historical reasons. Many slums in places like Mumbai and India were initially villages. They were fishing villages. They were potters' villages that remained informal. The formal city grew around them, but they tried to retain their sense of place, but they've obviously changed over the decades. So I'd love to hear from all three of you what you think of this idea of sense of place in these informal settlements. And so, Jessica, maybe we can begin with you. If you could reflect a little bit on this topic.
Yeah, of course. So retaining a sense of place, I mean, I would say that's hard when you're living in your vehicle because they make you move like every 3 days. Otherwise, it gets cited. So like imagine trying to have a sense of place when you're being moved around so often. And that's what's really is happening, not just also with people living in vehicles, but also with people living in tents. Because, I mean, they're not allowed to camp during daylight hours. Like they come and tell them you got to take it down. So just imagine trying to build a sense of place when it's just constant movement all around. And that's what's been happening here in the Bay Area for like, years, And I feel like us having that attitude to address, homelessness, it's not really helping people get back on their feet, Like any human being needs to be able to like plant their roots, somewhere to be able to grow, And I think like even if it's something that is like as just allocating a place, or allocating like streets where people can actually be at peace, that we allocate a place for them in the city. Like I think like that would really help, But right now we're not doing that at all. Like I think like right now cities are claiming even public space, they're like, this is ours because this is taxpayers' money and, we're supposed to take care of it. But really the city's supposed to take care of the people, and if the people need the public space, then we should be making it work for them, I think that's really what the space was created for. So I just think that, yeah, our priorities are just not right now. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
No, go ahead. What are you going to say?
No, but I'm just saying, like, Yeah, but I think like definitely like a sense of place is important just for anybody, and I think like just taking it out of this context, like it's important for every human being, animals, plants. You know, we all need a sense of environment that where we belong. You know, to be able to thrive. But
Yeah, and we saw what formality did, for example, with all these urban renewal projects. I mean, Pruitt-Igoe is a fantastic example, and which became a poster child in a way for the complete failure of, in a way, but not exactly. It's not that public housing is bad. It's not that welfare programs are bad. It's just that project became a kind of a poster child for a certain kind of intervention of the government, but that produced a non-place in a way. And so many projects that were created that were non-places in the world, across the world. You see it a lot in Mumbai, where I do some work, where slum rehabilitation housing tends to be really, really bad, very awful. And it takes what could have been, relatively some sort of community, completely changes and transforms it with these huge slabs of towers that are about 8 to 10 feet tall, 8 to 10 stories tall, with barely like 3 meters between them. And these are slum rehousing projects. So anyway, yeah, it's so there's a kind of a destruction in a way that occurs with those kinds of projects. So anyway, maybe Beatrice, we can get some of your thoughts on what you see here in terms of place.
Yeah, I really think the sense of place is important, and I think from Jessica's reflection, I really got a stark difference between, of course, how the sense of place is created where she is and here in Nairobi, and especially because, first of all, the informal settlements in Nairobi are mainly semi-permanent, so they'll really not be mobile as such as in Jessica's case. So people will basically set up 10 by 10 feet structures using corrugated iron sheets. And so I think there is a better position or platform then for them to create a sense of space, because they are not really required to move frequently, unless then there is a demolition or an eviction by the state. And so what we see in Nairobi settlement is people trying to create a sense of place, because they really feel excluded from the city itself. And I think with my experience, I've worked in a big settlement called Mukuru, and also a big settlement called Kibera. I'm sure maybe some of us may have heard of them. And people here, when we discuss about what they feel about being part of Nairobi city, being part of their settlements, they actually feel like they're not part of the city. And so they have to create the environment they can relate to, an environment where they can feel home within these settlements. And so sometimes they try to personify or to add value to these spaces so that they make more sense for them. And there are pretty many examples of how this has happened. For example, when I reflect about one of the settlements I've worked in called Dandora, it's next to one of the largest dump sites in the city, or in the country actually. And the settlement has really been known for, an unclean settlement with a lot of solid waste around, and a place where kids cannot really enjoy their free play and all that. And residents have really come together to clear dumping sites and transform them into green spaces where children can actually play, and where the youth can also use different activities to earn them income. I think possibly there's a link I had shared earlier to show just one of the projects that has been transformed from a dump site to a really multi-purpose, lucrative center that is beneficial for all. So I think communities are really proactive in creating these spaces for themselves and creating a place they can identify with in the communities. One thing I'm hesitant about, and I'm glad, Tanu, you raised it, is how also the sense of place is romanticized. Like, for example, if you look at the video that we just saw about the Torre David, I have quite a bit of questions that really come up from that, because we at one point see one household that is trying to expand their house, of course, because the family has grown bigger and they need, of course, more space. But then I'm curious about, like the load-bearing capacity of the building. If every household, continues expanding their house, and, it's the years later and maybe there is double the capacity in the building that was planned for, there's possibly going to have collapsing or something like that may happen, which is also a hazard for the people who are living there. So sometimes when people create a sense of place, it sometimes can be a hazard also for themselves. And it can also lead to exclusion. And this we have seen, especially in Nairobi. In my work, I've engaged in communities where the place they have created is so related to only the people who are there, such that new people who start coming in really feel excluded from the settlements they actually felt would be home for them. So I think creating a sense of place is good, but I think also a bit of flexibility is required so that it can be a space that is also welcoming for maybe other people who may want to come into the settlement, and also to try and link this with a bit of safety so that we are not creating more vulnerability on top of the risk that is already there.
Yeah, that's a great point by Susie Smith here in the chat, where she said, how do we support informal arrangements while not allowing for exploitative and unsafe situations? And we see that a little bit with Intore David. It's very, very unsafe. I mean, and that's the point that the government has sort of condoned that and allowed it to go on for a long time, especially under Maduro, and that has been exactly this sort of problem. Also, I just want to encourage folks who are watching, if you have questions for the panelists, please put them in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. Susanna, just going to you, rather than sort of talking in the abstract about a sense of place, maybe you can sort of reflect on that specifically with respect to Mercato itself, the place. Right in the beginning of the film, you showed how, or you mentioned, or the film mentions that there's going to be a new development coming there. And so it's probably going to erase some of this market and change the nature of the place. So do you know a little bit about those plans? And secondly, while you were filming there, you obviously spent a lot of time on the ground. I'd really be curious to, and the people are fascinating, absolutely, of course, that you filmed and you followed. But what is it about the place that you think is worth keeping, worth preserving, or that has a certain identity that is, so integral to city life in Addis Ababa, or something of that sort?
Great questions. I guess it's a sense of agency. It's like it's this agency that everyone has an energy of. It's the people, really. I mean, the place has. I mean, there's so many different sections of the market, right? I focus on the recycling portion, but there's a produce market. There's the recycle. There's incense. There's all these different sections that I actually don't. That I'm not really filming because it's such a huge. Section of a space. But so to answer your question, the sense of agency, that's really what I feel, solidifies kind of this entrepreneurship of the merchants. But in terms of plans, I mean, I filmed this so long ago. Now there are malls, there are structures, there are buildings that have replaced some of these sections. So, that has definitely changed the kind of the landscape, the fabric in which the language, even, there's this also dialect of, even bargaining, which is part of the language of open air market. And so that you can't bargain in a mall, there's a price on a tag, just these things that change kind of the landscape of the being. But, in terms of, even the archival footage, Mercato was built as a space to, during the Italian invasion in the 30s, this market was meant to, like, a space for Ethiopians to come together and sell, and buy from each other, as opposed to, the Italians that were taking over in their own market space. So it was really a place for Ethiopians to have their own people come and buy and support and exchange. And so, to know that support system and that community was there is something that is the foundation of this place, right? So,
did the people you followed and filmed, or maybe you had conversations with a few you interviewed, did they say something about what they'd like preserved there, or what their sense of agency was for the place?
Yeah, it's very interesting because anytime I would ask a question in regards to kind of nothing political, but just this idea that the space may be invaded. It's almost like they don't want to talk about it. They want to preserve this idea of their power. So I thought that was also interesting. I wanted to respect that, that's just kind of my approach to my filmmaking. And, I want to kind of capture the essence of a person and what is behind what they do, what is their passion, and what gives them the motive to thrive. So it was interesting though, every time I would ask, what would you do if if this turned into a mall, they really would tiptoe around those questions. And so I wanted to preserve the essence of what is here at the time so that it would sustain in the film, because it's very different if you go to Mercado now versus the Mercado I captured. So I think that stands. So, yeah.
Which is great in a way. The film is now captures them all for the Mercado for posterity, which is great. Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. So maybe we can take one last sort of idea and float it around with all three of you, which is I'm not usually a policy kind of person, but we are all forced to, and sometimes I can wear my urban planning hat, and but we have been saying that the state is essential. You cannot, informal settlements beyond a point become unsustainable on their own, right? There has to be, they can manage, but I think my activist friends in Mumbai claim all the time that what they call Nivara Hak, which is a right to shelter, that you cannot destroy anyone's home. So not only is it right to shelter, but right to housing and so on and so on. And so how can we think about this? And within this context, it's also this question of making demands from the state so that the state can better examine its own actions and make the right decisions to improve the lives of millions. Any ideas that you all have through your work and your experiences that might begin to answer this question or even contribute to it, or in how we can think about it in terms of planning or policy or some kind of fix, if possible? Beatrice, you wanna start from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. I can start. For me, first of all, policy is not really a problem. I don't see policy as a problem because in Nairobi, the informality is a big problem, but we have a lot of policies supporting slum upgrading and participatory slum upgrading in that essence. What I see as the problem is the actual willpower for the government to implement these policies, and also the understanding of the people of these policies. So like, for example, we've had the constitution which provides for a special planning area approach it has been there since 2010, but people actually didn't know that there exists provision in the constitution that can really help them, address their needs or maybe pressure the government to really fulfill their needs. So I think also the understanding of the people of the policies that are actually there to help them is really lacking. And I think there needs to be that bridge where people actually know the entry points through which they can approach the government. Because, like, for example, I've participated in the Mukuru Special Planning Area upgrading program. And this one was, of course, declared through the provision that is provided for in the Constitution. And for years, communities did not know that that was there. But of course, when the civil society came in and of course created awareness within communities that this instrument is actually here for your use, and I think you should use it or leverage this instrument, then communities were able to self-organize, mobilize, and with collective activism, they were able to, demand for the declaration of the area as a special planning area, which then, of course, provides for planning, a space for planning. So I think bridging the knowledge gap between the policy environment and the frameworks that are there and the communities is really important. One thing also that I really acknowledge, especially with my practice, is that, of course, there is a big difference between the pace at which informal settlements develop and the rate at which policies can be formulated. For example, next year we might even have 10 more informal settlements developed. but it's unlikely that we develop 10 policies to support, the different informal settlements that keep coming up. So what we recommend for is really policy that is flexible enough and responsive enough to address needs that keep coming up. Because of course, then informal settlements may look similar in terms of their physical outlook. Maybe you just assume it's 10 by 10 feet, iron sheet houses with lack of infrastructure, but the social elements are really different, the socioeconomic elements. And I think a policy then, a good policy then really should address the needs of different informal settlements without being too specific to one and without being too abstract that it's unable to, respond to what is required to be addressed. So I think this is really what I think about policy. And I would caution really diving deep into forming too many policies without really forming proper frameworks for implementing these policies, because otherwise we end up with documents and documents in law, but no practice. And I think what we're chasing for is action that we can see within communities. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Susanna, would you like to take this on? I mean, again, from your perspective.
Yeah, I just love what Beatrice. I was just really, yeah, I don't know. I think the government and, forming relationships with the folks that are going to be affected. I don't know. I didn't focus on that. I really wanted to stay primarily on the merchants and kind of their dreams and their value systems and what they need. But there's a disconnect, at least in Ethiopia and Mercado, in terms of what, the government feels, that is, best for Mercado and what the merchants actually need. But I will say there is this kind of mapping system that has developed, because Mercado is a very unorganized, sprawling market system. And so they've developed almost a mapping so that you can navigate these different sections. And that for me is a successful communication between the community and the government in terms of what can make this a more organized, so that's like the start, I think, of the possibility of a future positive endeavor. But again, a lot has been erased since I've filmed. A lot of infrastructure has been in place. A lot of butter is being sold in malls, which is maybe Mercado Part 2. But I think what Beatrice is saying, I mean, it's really it's a complicated framework that needs a lot of delegation and proper framework. But really the communication between what the merchants really need and how the government can instill that, I think, is proper. But the mapping system for me, I think, is the first step, really. So.
Oh, thank you. That was great. That was really great. And I love when you talk about the idea of opportunities and aspirations. And of course, your film is so poignantly brings that out. This idea of opportunities, aspirations of people, and these places capture that. And we have to build those kinds of ideas into policy as well. The policy can't just be this, deadpan. Highly bureaucratic kind of tool. It has to go beyond just a purely bureaucratic tool. Jessica, would you like to talk a little bit about, a fix or something of that sort? I mean, you've thought about these things quite a bit, so.
Yeah. So, I would say that here in the Bay Area, there's really a lack of policy in addressing homelessness. And now, when I say that, it's like, because everything that they come up with is always temporary. And we cannot have temporary fixes anymore. Like, this is just bringing more people into the system, trying to shove them into one funnel. And then not everybody's able to get in there. So I just feel like we really have to have better policy that integrates everyone. And not just that, but also, like, for example, like right now they have this policy of putting people into hotel rooms. And I think that is great. They finally have a place where they can have some respite. But if it's temporary and you're only taking them away from the street for a couple of months and then throwing them back in there, that's really not fair. We cannot do that to people, because then we're promising them that we're going to help them. And then that doesn't really happen. Then how do we expect them to continue to trust the government, right? So I just feel like there really has to be something done where like we gotta stop with all the temporary fixes. I mean, our policymakers have really to have to commit to different solutions, not just one. There's different outlets, and I feel like that's what has to be done. There has to be more commitment. And also, I think another policy that has to be accepted is that I think that housing should be a human right, and I think right now it's not on the books, unfortunately, or like it's not written plainly in that manner. But I mean, if we think about it, when we take somebody's shelter away, whether that's like vehicle, a tent, or a structure, you're taking away their shelter and you're exposing them back into the elements, throwing them back into further homelessness. And that, to me, that is cruel and unusual punishment because, being poor is not a crime. So why are you taking away their only means of survival, to be well, to be healthy, to be able to go to school, go to work? Like, we really are punishing the people for not really doing nothing that they, no harm. They're not doing no harm. They're just trying to survive. And that, I feel like we really have to think about that the actions that we're taking is actually unusual and cruel punishment. And I think the government has to change that, or we got to take them to court, to show that they really are doing bad things. And I feel like a lot of encampments are doing that now, because they realize that, the seizure of their possessions, their only means of survival, like that is, something that should be protected by the U.S. Constitution. So I think that now they really are trying to make their claims. And yeah, I think like I feel inspired by that, to see that people are willing to stand up for their rights. So, but I mean, it's not easy, not a lot of people can actually go to court to fight for their rights. And I feel like it shouldn't be that way, because it takes a lot of resources just to get there. So I feel like policymakers also have to make it like, like Susanna was saying, you have to communicate with the people. You have to talk to them and come, actually realize what it's like to live in their community. And then, we can have better solutions. But yeah. Thank you.
Oh, that's wonderful. I really can't agree with you more about the right to shelter, the right to housing. You cannot take away anybody's shelter. You cannot take away anybody's, life, even wherever it may be, whether it's a car or a shack. And that's so true. And I think at a more fundamental level, I mean, at least I also want to think of it more in terms of a planner and an architect and urban designers and people who work in states and in the government and so on, is to, and the larger population, we're sort of in a way brainwashed into some kind of an idea of a city or a neighborhood or a community that has a certain look to it, and that that look has to be somehow maintained, and it's a very airbrushed look. And the minute there's anything informal or something deviant or something rhizomatic that's growing into that, there's instantly a problem with it, and people want to get rid of that. And what a lot of people don't realize is that you're actually getting rid of someone's shelter, someone's livelihood, someone's place, and that is unconscionable in many ways. Yeah, thanks for that, Jessica. That was wonderful. So thanks to all of you for this really wonderful discussion. And on that super note from Jessica, maybe we can wrap up a little bit. I'm just going to call Faye back to take us towards the end here. But thank you all for this really wonderful discussion. Thanks a lot. Faye, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to our moderator, Tanu Sankalia. It's very challenging to understand each place. It's just a glimpse, but it's really an invitation for you to investigate, take action, really understand what formality, informality is. There's lots of different things that are going on in the city of San Francisco, for example, and also in Berkeley, where Jessica is, from encampments to cities buying hotels for permanent supportive housing. So I'm going to drop a link in the chat for folks to take a survey. It'll help us better understand who we're serving, who we're not serving, and how we can do a better job all around. And I want to thank all the volunteers, especially Kavya Palepu, who's on social media, and Maisie Jackson, who is a USF student blogging for us tonight. I also want to thank the SF UFF core team, especially Crystal Chelik and Omid Manicherry tonight, who are doing the tech. And then if you come to our events this week, you'll meet the other team members, Susie Smith, Ron Sundstrom, and Robin Abad. And as you may know, we're a very small organization run by volunteer fuels and donations. So we'll put another link in the chat for y'all to donate to us. And if you want to know more about us, follow us on our social media. And to give you a preview of more programs this week, tomorrow night, Thursday nights, join us in person at the African American Arts and Culture Complex in the Western Addition and the Historic Fillmore District. The program is Here, Now, and Beyond, Cities of the Afrofuture. You can RSVP via our website, and it'll be a wonderful evening outside under a tent, warm, with music and community. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.